My neighbor started leaving his upstairs window open every night after my wife died. I don't mean occasionally. I mean every single night, from sometime around sundown until at least 2 or 3 in the morning, which was usually when I finally stopped sitting at the kitchen table and went to bed. Dead of winter in northern Michigan, the kind of cold where your pipes crack if you forget to leave the heat on. And that window was open. Every night, lights on. I need to give you some context before I go any further, because this is the kind of story that sounds like nothing until it becomes everything. My wife Sarah passed in October, pancreatic cancer. We'd been out on our 2-acre lot off Route 37 for 12 years. Bought the land young, built the house ourselves over 2 summers, the whole thing. When she got sick, we talked about moving closer to town, closer to her doctors, but she didn't want to. She said she wanted to look out at trees, not parking lots. So we stayed. And then she was gone, and it was just me in a house I'd built with my hands for a life that had stopped. Hal was my only real neighbor. His property sat maybe a quarter mile east of mine, just visible through the tree line when the leaves were down. We'd been cordial for years, the kind of neighbors who wave when they see each other, help each other dig out after a storm, exchange the occasional bag of produce. He was in his late 60s, lived alone, had a tabby cat named something I could never remember. Quiet man, kept to himself in a way that felt respectful rather than strange. So when I started noticing his upstairs window open in January, the window facing my property, the one above his back porch, my first thought was that he'd had a pipe issue and was airing out water damage. That made sense. Old houses in Michigan get pipe problems in winter all the time. I figured it would be resolved in a week. It wasn't resolved in a week. After about 10 days, I started paying closer attention. The window would be open by 5 in the evening, right when the temperature started dropping hard. The light inside was always on, a yellowish lamp light, warm. From where I sat at my kitchen table, it looked like a lit stage. Just that one rectangle of light in the dark and the curtain pulling slightly in the wind. I convinced myself he liked the fresh air. Some people sleep better in the cold. I'm a general contractor. I spend half my life in other people's houses watching them do things that make no sense to me. I've learned not to ask. I let it go. What I couldn't let go of about 3 weeks in was the movement. I'd be sitting at the table around midnight, couldn't tell you what I was thinking about, probably nothing, the way grief makes your brain go static, and I'd see something shift behind that window. Not Hal. Hal was a big guy, wide through the shoulders. This was smaller, the kind of movement you see when someone crosses in front of a lamp, a shadow crossing the light, slight, quick, and wrong in a way I couldn't name right away. I told myself it was the cat. A few nights later, I drove past Hal's place on the way back from the hardware store, and he was out front splitting wood. I stopped, and we talked for a few minutes. Nothing serious. How's the driveway holding up? Did I see that the Hendersons put their place up for sale? At the end of it, I asked, as casual as I could make it, whether he had anyone staying with him for the winter. A grandkid, maybe, or a relative. He looked at me in a way I can only describe as careful, like he was deciding something. Then he smiled and said no, it'd just been him since New Year's. Said his sister had visited for the holidays, but she'd gone back to Traverse City weeks ago. I nodded and let it go. That was a Tuesday. The following Saturday night, sometime around 1 in the morning, I was at the kitchen table again. Couldn't sleep. The house had that particular silence that you only notice when the person who used to fill it is gone. I had a cup of coffee I wasn't drinking, and I was looking out the window at nothing. And then I was looking at Hal's window because the shape was there again. I don't know what made me actually focus on it that night instead of just registering it and looking away. Maybe it was the angle. The figure was standing close to the window, closer than before, and the lamp was casting enough light that the silhouette had detail to it. The way it stood, the slight forward lean weight on the left side, the way the head tilted down just a few degrees like someone reading or thinking. I knew that posture. I had watched that posture for 12 years across kitchen tables and on hiking trails and in waiting rooms with bad lighting. And then I noticed what it was wearing. Something blue, a top or a sweater, the particular blue of a particular sweater. I got up from the table without deciding to. I walked down the hall to the bedroom where Sarah's things were still in the closet because I hadn't been able to move them. I turned on the light, her side of the closet, the folded things on the shelf, The blue sweater was gone. I stood there for a long time. I went through the whole shelf. I checked the floor of the closet. I went back to the kitchen and looked at the window, and there was nothing there anymore. Just the light and the curtain and the cold. I called the police the next morning. I didn't know how to explain it over the phone, so I just said I thought someone had been in my house and I needed a welfare check on my neighbor. 2 deputies drove out. They knocked on Hal's door and he answered, and they went inside. I don't know exactly what they expected to find. I don't know what I expected either. What they found was the second bedroom. The door had been locked from the inside, which Hal said he couldn't explain. When they got it open, the room held 23 items from my house. A cutting board Sarah had kept on the counter, a photo from the hallway, her reading glasses, the blue sweater folded neatly on a shelf, smaller things, a coffee mug, a book with a cracked spine, a pair of her socks, all of it arranged, not piled, arranged, like someone had thought carefully about where each thing should go. The sheriff's deputy told me Hal had been accessing my property through a loose panel on my basement foundation wall. The kind of thing I'd noticed wobbling before and kept meaning to fix. He'd been going in and out for the better part of 18 months, taking 1 or 2 things at a time. Never anything that would obviously be missed. When they asked him why, he said he was keeping them safe. That was it, keeping them safe. He didn't elaborate, and as far as I know, he never did. The thing that stayed with me, the thing I keep coming back to, was the movement in the window. When the deputies went back to Hal's house to finish their walkthrough, they noted his cat in the upstairs room, the tabby. It had a habit, apparently, of standing on the windowsill and watching the property next door. That's the explanation. The cat. That's what I saw moving in the window at 1 in the morning. But here's what I can't square and what I think about every time winter comes around, and I look out at that tree line. The figure I saw that Saturday night wasn't on the windowsill. It was standing. It was standing the way a person stands. And whatever was wearing that blue sweater was the right height, the right build, the right lean. Hal moved to be near his daughter in Sault Ste. Marie about 6 months after. The charges didn't stick the way they should have. Something about what legally constitutes theft when the items are returned. I still live in the house. I fixed the foundation panel. Sarah's blue sweater is back on the shelf where it belongs. I haven't moved it. I don't go into that room much anymore, but when I do, I check every time. It's always there, which should make me feel better. Mostly, it just makes me check again. I work from home, or worked from home, I should say, because we don't live there anymore. But for about 8 months before we left, I was home with our daughter, Lily, while my wife, Kristen, handled the 9 to 5. And that meant I was the one who saw everything that happened across the street from our house in the Clearwater Ridge development in Westminster, Colorado. I want to be upfront. I'm a pretty observant guy. That's not me bragging, it's actually relevant. When you spend your days in a house with a 2-year-old and a baby monitor and 3 windows facing a quiet cul-de-sac, you get to know the neighborhood in more detail than most people would. I knew which houses got Amazon deliveries on which days. I knew which dog walked which owner. I knew the family at the corner had a teenager who drove too fast. I was home. I paid attention. I want you to understand that because what I'm about to describe is not something I could have missed or misread. The house across the street, 14 Clearwater Court, had been empty for 5 months when a moving truck showed up one Thursday morning. I was feeding Lily breakfast, and I watched the whole thing through the kitchen window. There were 5 people unloading that truck. 2 adults, a man and a woman, both maybe late 30s, and 3 kids, a girl who looked about 12, a boy maybe 8 or 9, and a younger boy around 5. Normal-looking family. They worked efficiently. By midday, the truck was gone, and the house had curtains in the windows. I figured I'd give them a day or 2 to settle before going over with the welcome basket. Standard neighborhood protocol. 2 days later, I knocked on the door at number 14 with a bottle of wine and some cookies Kristen had baked. A woman answered. She was not any of the 5 people I had watched unload that truck. I'm not talking about a passing resemblance issue or bad lighting. I stood 2 feet from those people for the better part of a morning. I know what I saw. This woman at the door was in her mid-50s, short gray hair, friendly enough smile. She thanked me for the basket and said she was glad to be on such a nice street. I said something appropriate and walked back across the cul-de-sac, trying to figure out if I'd imagined the entire moving day. I hadn't. I know what I saw. Over the next week, I started keeping an informal count. I was home all day, every day. The front door of number 14 faces my kitchen window at about a 45-degree angle. Every time I saw someone enter or exit, I looked. In 7 days, I counted at least 11 different adults. I saw the original woman from moving day twice more, and there was a younger guy in his 20s who came and went 3 times. But most of them I only ever saw once. And then there were the children. A school bus picked up from our street every morning at 7:20. Over the following week, I watched 4 different children leave number 14 to catch that bus. Not the same 4 children rotating, different children. An older girl I'd never seen before. Then 2 boys who didn't match the kids from moving day. Then a girl who looked no older than Lily. None of them matched the 3 I'd watched move in. I mentioned all of this to Kristen, and she said I was catastrophizing. She said some families have a lot of relatives visit, and maybe they were all taking turns staying with each other. That explanation made enough sense that I let it sit for a while. Then Lily said the thing about the people not being finished. She was standing at the living room window one afternoon. She was 2. She wasn't saying a lot of clearly articulated sentences yet, but she had about 40 words she used consistently and correctly. I was in the kitchen and I heard her say something, and I came out to check on her, and she was just standing there looking at number 14 with her hands on the glass. When I asked her what she was looking at, she said, as clearly as she's ever said anything, "The people aren't finished." I picked her up and moved her away from the window and didn't really sleep for 2 nights thinking about it. What finally happened, the thing that I cannot get out of my head, was on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I decided to take Lily for a walk around the cul-de-sac, partly because she needed air and partly because I wanted an excuse to walk past number 14 at close range and look in through the front window. The house had a large picture window in the front room. From the sidewalk, you could see straight in. There was a long dining table in there. 8 people seated at it, 4 adults, 4 children, none of whom I recognized. They were not eating, they were not talking, they were not looking at each other. Every single person at that table was looking at the front window. Not toward the window, at the exact spot where Lily and I were standing on the sidewalk. I don't know how long I stood there before I started moving again. I don't think it was long. Lily was quiet the whole way home. I reported it to our HOA. They did nothing. I called the local non-emergency police line and explained what I'd been seeing for the past few weeks. A car came by, 2 officers knocked on the door, a woman answered, not anyone I'd seen before. And the officers left 10 minutes later, apparently satisfied. A friend of mine who works in real estate found out who had purchased number 14. It was an LLC called Meridian Residential Holdings, registered in Delaware. When he dug a little deeper, he found that the same LLC owned 14 properties with near-identical footprints in Colorado, Nevada, Idaho, and Utah. Each one was listed as a single-family residence. Each one appeared, from the outside, to be occupied by a standard American family. He couldn't find any information about what Meridian Residential Holdings actually did. The company had been registered for 11 years. Its listed agent was a lawyer's office in Wilmington that handled dozens of shell companies. The house emptied out completely about 3 weeks after the table incident. New people moved in 6 weeks after that. A normal couple in their 30s. No kids. Golden retriever. I introduced myself. They seemed perfectly fine. We moved the following fall when Kristen got a job offer in Denver. I told her the commute was too long to make sense staying in Westminster. That was true. It was also not the full reason. I've never been able to find anything more about Meridian Residential Holdings. The company's registration is still active. The other 14 properties are still listed. I think about the table sometimes. I think about how everyone at it was already facing the window before we got there. Before I walked out of my front door with Lily, before we crossed the street, before we were anywhere near that sidewalk, whoever those people were, they were already looking at the right spot. I don't know how that's possible. I don't know what the right question even is. I just know that my daughter stopped saying that phrase about the people not being finished. And I was more relieved about that than I've been about most things in my life. I want to say up front that I'm not the kind of woman who preys into other people's business. I spent 30 years as a school librarian. I know how to be quietly present without inserting myself. My husband Frank will tell you the same thing. I've always believed in minding my own affairs. I say that because what I'm about to describe is not the result of nosy neighbors. It's the result of a dog with no sense of what property lines mean and a wristwatch that did not belong to anyone who should have been buried in a vegetable garden. Frank and I moved to the Saguaro Vista community in Scottsdale, Arizona 6 years ago. Retirement community. HOA, meticulously maintained properties, the whole thing. The kind of neighborhood where a weed in the front landscaping generates an actual written notice. We were in our mid-50s, the kids were gone, and we wanted warm winters and something quieter than the suburb outside Chicago we'd spent 20 years in. We found it. We love it there. That's important to understand. This is not a story about a place that was wrong from the beginning. The neighborhood was genuinely wonderful. Our next-door neighbor on the east side was a man named Paul Albrecht, 60-something, retired, widowed a few years before we moved in. He was polite and unassuming, the kind of neighbor you're grateful for. He kept his property immaculate, and he had an absolutely extraordinary garden along the fence line between our properties, about 30 feet long, growing tomatoes and zucchini and bell peppers that were, no exaggeration, some of the finest vegetables I've ever eaten. He gave bags of produce away to everyone on the block. People loved him for it. The thing that scratched at me very quietly from almost the beginning was the soil. I'm not a gardener by training, but Frank is. And the first time we walked the property line and looked at Paul's beds, Frank said, not suspiciously, just observationally, that he had no idea how Paul was growing anything in that caliche. That's the soil you get in the desert. Pale, almost white, alkaline, terrible for vegetables unless you amend it heavily and consistently. Paul's beds looked exactly like what you'd expect unimproved caliche to look like. Not rich, not dark, not the kind of earth that produces the size of tomatoes we were eating. Frank figured he was importing compost or using some soil amendment we weren't aware of. I filed it away and didn't think about it again for a long time. About 8 months after we moved in, I woke up early, probably around 5 in the morning, and went to the bedroom window to check the weather before deciding whether to go for a walk. I could see Paul's garden from that window. Paul was out there in the gray pre-dawn light, working close to the fence. He was digging, but not the way you dig when you're turning soil or planting. He was digging something in, something large. He had a canvas bag, maybe 2 feet long, and he placed it in the hole carefully and then filled it back in and tamped the soil flat. Then he went inside and came back 10 minutes later with a tomato seedling and planted it directly over the spot. I stood at that window for a long time after he went back inside. I told myself there were many reasonable explanations. Bone meal, a large root ball, compost in a bag that he didn't want to scatter. I know how those explanations sound now. They sounded reasonable at the time. I watched it happen 4 more times over the next 14 months. The last time, the bag was considerably larger than the first. A different shape, too. Longer, more irregular. I didn't let myself think too carefully about the shape. The thing that moved me from uneasy to genuinely alarmed had nothing to do with Paul, directly. A woman came to my door one afternoon in November, late 40s, tired looking, like someone who had been tired for a long time. She said her name was Deanna, and she was looking for her mother. Her mother was 67, had been living in Scottsdale for the past year, and had gone quiet about 4 months ago. The last thing Deanna knew was that her mother had met a man in her neighborhood, someone she described as kind and attentive, and had mentioned going to see his garden. I told Deanna I wasn't sure I could help her, but I asked if she'd tried the neighbors. I watched from my window as she knocked on Paul's door. He answered, and they stood on his porch for a few minutes. Whatever he told her, she left looking no different than when she arrived. Later that evening, I asked Paul, as casually as I could manage, if he'd had a visitor. He said a woman had come looking for someone she thought lived on our street. He said he didn't know anyone matching the description. He said it was sad, and he hoped she found her mother. And then he offered me a bag of tomatoes. I took the tomatoes and went inside and stood in my kitchen, not eating them. Our dog Biscuit is a 12-pound terrier mix who has exactly one hobby, and that hobby is digging. We'd been careful about keeping him away from the fence line because the garden was Paul's pride and we didn't want trouble. But about 3 weeks after Deanna came to my door, Biscuit got through a gap in our gate during Frank's morning walk and went directly for the edge of Paul's garden. He came back with a wristwatch in his mouth. Not a cheap watch, a heavy leather band watch, the kind men wore in the 70s and 80s. It was dirty, but not corroded. When I cleaned it off, I could see the engraving on the back. 3 initials, MRT, and a date that was 40 years old. I called the Scottsdale Police Department's non-emergency line and told them everything. I told them about the bags. I told them about Deanna. I told them about MRT. I don't know what I expected them to do. I half expected them to tell me I was describing a man who buried yard waste unusually. They got a warrant 2 days later. I'm not going to go into all of it. I think most of you can fill in the shape of what they found. What I will tell you is that there were 7 of them, and MRT was among them, and the woman Deanna had been looking for was not. They searched the whole property after that, and they found Paul's wife, Margaret, in the basement. She had been down there for 4 years. The length of time she'd supposedly been dead. The reason Paul was widowed. She was physically uninjured. She had food, a bed, a bathroom. She would not explain to anyone why she had never left or tried to leave or made a sound when people were in the house above her. As far as I know, she still hasn't. Paul is in custody. The case has been going on for a long time, and I don't expect it to be simple. I still live in Saguaro Vista. The new owners of Paul's property tore out the garden beds down to the bare calish. I thought I'd feel something watching them do it. Relief, maybe. Mostly I just kept thinking about Margaret in that basement, about what she could hear from down there, about whether she ever looked up at the ceiling when Paul was out there in the early morning, tamping the soil flat, planting something on top, about whether she knew what was in the bags, whether she knew how many. I think about that more than I'd like to. I bought my condo because it was quiet. That sounds like a small thing, but if you've ever lived somewhere with bad soundproofing, and I spent 4 years in an apartment in Capitol Hill where I could hear my neighbor's alarm clock go off every morning, you understand why quiet was at the top of my list. 12 floors up in a newer building in South Lake Union, Seattle. Double-paned windows. Concrete and steel construction. When I toured the unit, the leasing agent tapped the wall and said, "Go ahead, try to hear anything." I couldn't. I moved in September, started my new job at a software company in Belltown. 31 years old, first place I'd owned, rather than rented. I want to give you that picture of who I was going into this, because context matters. I'm an engineer. I problem solve for a living. My default is to look for a technical explanation. I want that established. The first thing I noticed about the unit below mine, 11C, was how truly quiet it was. In a well-built building, you still hear things. Footsteps when someone moves between rooms, a television late at night, the bass note of a washing machine. From 11C, I heard almost nothing. The person down there barely seemed to exist. What I did hear occasionally was a very specific sound. Not footsteps, something more deliberate than footsteps. A short mechanical thump, followed by a pause, followed by another. Like someone setting equipment down carefully or adjusting something on a hard surface. I heard it maybe twice a week, always in the evening, and I kept telling myself it was something mundane. A home gym, maybe, or a standing desk. Old buildings settle. New buildings have HVAC sounds. I didn't pay it much attention. What I started paying attention to about 3 months in was the beep. Every evening at 8:42, I would hear a single short electronic beep from somewhere below me. Not loud. If I were watching something or playing music, I wouldn't have caught it. But in a quiet apartment at the end of a quiet workday, it was consistent enough that I started to notice the pattern. One beep, 8:42. Every single evening without exception. I Googled it. I checked if any of my own devices were making noise at that hour. Nothing matched. I filed it under building related and moved on. Then my internet started doing something strange. I have a gigabit connection and I work remotely. I notice when my bandwidth drops. Starting sometime in November, my speeds would crater to almost nothing for about 60 seconds every evening, right at 8:42. When the minute passed, everything returned to normal. It happened every single day. I called my ISP. They ran a line test and found no issues. A technician came out, looked at everything, shrugged, and left. The drops kept happening. About a month after that, I had a different technician to look at my router, someone a coworker recommended, a freelancer who does residential network setups. He was there for about 20 minutes before he came out of my home office with a look I didn't know how to read. He'd found a second device on my network, a small wireless bridge plugged into the back of my router where it wasn't visible from the front. It had been there since before I moved in. The MAC address registered to hardware manufactured 4 years earlier. It was pulling data from my network for exactly 60 seconds every evening and then going idle. He asked me if I had put it there. I had not. I took it to the building manager the next morning. We went together to Unit 11C and knocked. No answer. The building manager used her master key. The apartment was empty of furniture. Not empty in a way that suggested someone had just moved out. Empty in the way of a room that had never been lived in. No rugs, no marks on the walls, no kitchen items. One folding chair near the center of the room. A single desk against the wall. On the desk, 8 monitors in 2 rows, all dark. And on the wall beside the desk, a pegboard with rows of USB drives. Each drive was labeled with a piece of masking tape. The labels were unit numbers: 12A, 12B, 12C, that was mine, 12D, 11A, 11B, going on and on. Every unit in the building represented. The police came. They pulled the drives. The drive labeled 12C contained 2 years and 4 months of audio and video recordings from my apartment. High resolution, time-stamped. Every room that faced outward had been captured by a camera I have still never located. The recording started 4 months before I moved in, which means they started during the previous tenant. The previous tenant's recordings were on the same drive, same label, same unit number, same systematic documentation. The detective who interviewed me said the technical setup was sophisticated, the kind of thing that takes both expertise and access. The building manager confirmed that the previous leaseholder of Unit 11C had vacated without notice 8 months before I moved in. His application documents were traced to an address in Redmond that turned out to be a UPS store. They never identified him. As far as I know, they still haven't. I moved out of 12C 4 months after all of this, broke my lease, and paid the penalty without arguing about it. I now live in a house in Beacon Hill with walls I've inspected myself. I swept the place twice with a signal detector before I unpacked. What I think about more than anything is the other drives on that pegboard. Every unit in the building had one. I was not the point. I was one data point in something much larger that I do not understand and that no one has explained to me. The 842 beep was the daily system check. The 1-minute bandwidth draw was the nightly upload window. 60 seconds, every evening, pulling whatever the cameras had collected. For years, in a building full of people who had no idea. I still work in software. I still solve problems for a living. I've pulled apart this situation from every angle I know how to approach, and I cannot tell you what the recordings were for or who wanted them or whether anyone is still watching something like that somewhere else right now. The math on that last question is what keeps me up. There are a lot of buildings in this city. There are a lot of buildings in a lot of cities. The setup in Unit 11C costs someone real money and real time. People who spend that kind of money and time on something do not usually only do it once. That's where I always end up. That's the part I don't know how to put down. I'm an electrician. I wire houses for a living. Residential, mostly commercial. I understand how surveillance systems work. I know what a camera can see, what it can't see, what angle covers, what coverage zone. I want to be upfront about that because it's directly relevant to what I'm going to tell you, and it makes what happened harder to explain, not easier. My wife Megan and I moved to our house in Wake Forest, North Carolina the summer before our daughter Emma was born. Nice cul-de-sac, newer construction, the kind of neighborhood where people wave and you actually mean it. We felt good about it. First house, new baby coming. It was exactly what we wanted. Our neighbor Dale was the first person to introduce himself. 60-something, retired, always outside doing something with his yard. Big white smile. Brought over a pie the week we moved in, which Megan still talks about because it was genuinely one of the better pies she's ever had. We liked him. That's important to say. We genuinely liked him. About 3 months after we moved in, I decided to install a security camera in our backyard. New baby on the way, new neighborhood. I wanted to be able to see the perimeter from my phone. I put up a single camera on the back corner of the house, angled to cover the yard and the gate. When I walked out the next morning to check the sightlines, I noticed that Dale had a camera mounted on his fence post. New. Still had a small sticker on the housing, pointed not at his property, not at the shared gate or his tool shed, pointed at our upstairs nursery window. I told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe he'd just put it up and hadn't adjusted the angle yet. I gave it 2 days and checked again. It hadn't moved. I added a second camera on our side, pointed generally toward that corner of the yard. Within 48 hours, a new camera appeared on Dale's fence, slightly repositioned to compensate for mine. I want to be precise. This happened 5 times. I added a camera, he added a camera, his adjusted to match. It was systematic in a way that could not have been accidental. He was responding directly and specifically to my installations within a day or 2 each time. After the 5th round, he walked across the cul-de-sac, rang our doorbell, and stood there with that big white smile. He said he'd noticed I was setting up a security system and thought it was a great idea. He said he had a system of his own and would be happy to help me if I needed any advice. He said it was good to have neighbors who look out for each other. He said the neighborhood was really safe, but you could never be too careful with a new baby. I said thanks. We'd been managing fine. He said of course, went back home. That evening, Megan was nursing Emma in the nursery. She texted me, I was downstairs, and said she could see a red light blinking from Dale's side of the fence. Not a steady light, a blink. Once, twice, then nothing. I went upstairs and looked, and it was gone. But Megan had seen it from close up through the window. She said it came from something mounted low on the fence, angled up. I knocked on Dale's door the next afternoon. I was polite about it. I kept my voice even. I did not accuse him of anything. I told him I needed his cameras to be pointed at his own property, not at my windows. He smiled the entire time. He said his cameras were pointed at nothing of concern. He said I was welcome to look at the footage anytime if I was worried. He repeated that the neighborhood was very safe. I came home, sat down at my kitchen table, and searched Dale's full name plus Wake Forest and camera. He had a YouTube channel. He'd had it for 6 years. It was called Neighborhood Wildlife. Nature and outdoor content, birds, the occasional deer in the yard, nothing unusual from the outside. It had 240,000 subscribers. I started watching videos. In the 3rd video I opened, there was a brief clip, 4 seconds, filmed through a window. The angle was familiar. The window was mine. The room was my kitchen. The clip showed Megan at the counter making coffee. She was 8 months pregnant. I went through more videos. Over the course of that evening, I found clips from our house in 17 different uploads. Different rooms, different times of day. Emma's nursery, the living room, the back hallway, all of them brief, cut into longer nature footage videos in a way that felt deliberate, like they were hidden there. The most popular video on his channel was titled The New Family. It had been posted the week Emma came home from the hospital. It had 1.8 million views. I called the police that night. I won't take you through all of it. The report, the investigation, the lawyers, the back and forth about what actually constitutes illegal surveillance under North Carolina law and what falls into contested territory. All of that is still ongoing as far as I know. What I will tell you about is the comment section. While the police were involved and Dale's channel had been flagged, I went back and read through the comments on some of his older videos. His oldest video on the channel was 6 years ago. His comment sections had regular viewers who had been there since the beginning. People who left comments on every video knew the channel well. I found a comment on a video from 4 years before we moved into our house. Someone asking about the family before. There was another video, older still, from the year before that, where a commenter mentioned the family before that one. I looked at the posting dates. I cross-referenced them with what I knew about when previous owners had been in our house. Dale's channel had active, regular viewers watching footage from our address for at least 11 years. Before us, before the previous owners, before the owners before them. Different families in the same house, filmed through the same windows, cut into the same nature videos, watched by the same subscriber base. We moved out 4 months ago. We're renting in Raleigh right now while we figure out next steps. I inspect the perimeter of every house I walk through now. I do it the way I do a rough-in inspection, methodically, corner by corner, looking for things that shouldn't be there. I've gotten fast at it. I've gotten good at it. I haven't found anything since we left Wake Forest. I don't know if that means there's nothing there or if it means I haven't been thorough enough. Emma is 14 months old. She doesn't know any of this happened. I hope she never has reason to. But I keep thinking about those 11 years of comments. I keep thinking about the subscriber count. 240,000 people who found that channel watched it regularly and kept coming back. I don't know what they thought they were watching. I don't know what they told themselves it was. I know what it was. You know what makes every single one of these stories work? None of these people did anything wrong. They waved, they brought welcome baskets, they were polite, they followed every rule of being a decent neighbor, and it found them anyway. Like this video if you've been a good neighbor, and it hasn't necessarily helped. Subscribe, because that's the only thing you can actually control right now. And let us know in the comments. If you could only know the truth about one neighbor, which house on your street would you choose? Now, if you're feeling like you need some open air after all of that, the next video will not help you. Click now to watch 4 disturbing countryside horror stories. It turns out the middle of nowhere has the same problem as the house next door. Something is always watching. You just have a lot more space to not notice it. Thanks for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.